I got my career started as a futures and commodities broker. And so I got baptized in the deep end of the pool in 2008 when the housing market crashed. And so economics, the history of economics, the history of kind of geopolitics and the world and money and currency and where those things collide is something that I just absolutely love. Mm-hmm. So the topic, the news story we're talking about today was the comments from Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell last week. And basically, he just assured us that there is some bad banks out there, and there's going to be another bank crash, essentially. He essentially said that 60% of small banks own currently all the commercial real estate debt, which is where the looming problem currently exists. And basically, here's what he said. He said, if the economy evolves broadly as we expect, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year. But the economic outlook is uncertain, and ongoing progress towards our 2% inflation objective is not assured. Even so, Powell told committee members that there's no evidence and there's no reason to think that the U.S. economy is in or in some kind of short-term risk of falling into a recession. Far from it. Powell said the Fed was on a good path to achieve its hope for soft landing, in which inflation continues falling to its 2% target, while the economy grows and unemployment rate, currently at 3.7, remains low.
Can you break that down for us? Because there's a lot of fancy wordage in there.
So it's good PR is what they're trying to do, because they never want to spook the market into thinking that there is any kind of recession risk. This whole idea of a soft landing is something that historically they have tried to accomplish over the last 100 years as this problem continually persists over and over and over again, right? So every single time there's a crash, 1929, 1987, 2000.com, 2008, when I'm predicting 2025 due to all this mature commercial real estate debt coming due, it's always driven by a couple major things: cheap money and banks being over-leveraged every single time. There's no other way around it. It might come out in different shapes or form, whether it's residential mortgages like we saw in 2008, where they were giving out these ARM loans, which had fluctuating interest rates, and that was a big problem.
Yeah.
And pretty much anybody with a pulse could get a loan. Whether it was the savings and loan crisis in 1987, which is essentially they locked in savings rates, but then simultaneously increased rates from 10% to 20%. So if you were in a savings account at maybe 5.5%, you wouldn't really want to keep your money there. You would probably try to deploy it somewhere else. So there was a bank run. Effectively, none of these banks were solvent, which was the issue. 1929, similar kind of issue, overvalued businesses, over-leveraged banks, market collapses. There's a run on the banks, a run on capital, and nobody's solvent anymore. So it happens over and over and over again. But what we're doing today is unprecedented. So if you look back in 1987, when Alan Greenspan was the Fed chairman, at that point in time, interest rates were at like 10%, and we took them to 20%. So sounds like a big number, but most people are really bad at math. 10% to 20% is only a 2x increase. We're only doubling what we're doing. What we did from 2020 to date is we went from effectively zero, we'll call it 0.25 because it kind of fluctuated in there, to 5.5%. That's a 22x increase. And so the problem now that exists for all of these banks is they wrote loans on commercial real estate that is now going to come due, and those properties are materially lower. Call it $10, $15, $20 million. So if you have a maturity date and a balloon payment and you're supposed to refinance or sell that property, one, you're going to have to sell it at a loss. Two, you can't refinance it because you're upside down on the property, right? And so how are we going to navigate that, right? The only way to really get it done is to drop the interest rates, but then that exacerbates the problem all over again that we're already in. And so this idea of a soft landing is something that's kind of crazy. So, but before we go too deep, I want to watch Fed Chair Powell's actual comments so you guys can hear it for yourself.
Discuss the compound risks identified in commercial real estate lending, particularly at banks with large CRE concentrations and high fractions of uninsured deposits?
Sure. Let me say, I think there are just very, very few transactions in commercial real estate right now, particularly in the troubled areas. So it's not a question of prices still falling. It's a question that you don't have the kind of price discovery. You just have to assume that the prices are very low and have come down a lot. So on commercial real estate, we have a secular change in people working from home. This is one big part of it. That means that in many cities, the downtown office district is very underpopulated. There are empty buildings in many major and minor cities. It also means that all the retail that was there to service the thousands and thousands of people who work in those buildings, they're under pressure too. And banks will have made loans to.
So the part that he doesn't say is people are moving out of the city. Right. It's not just about work from home. It's the fact that living in city centers sucks. And so why would I live in a city center where it sucks, where there's crime, drugs, homelessness? This is every major city across the country. I mean, we're in Denver, which used to be considered clean, right? That place sucks now.
Bro, I was there recently. Dude just pulled out his weenie and started using the bathroom.
Stop.
I'm eating food. My guy just right next to the restaurant.
Unbelievable.
I'm like, bruh.
So you keep going.
So this we've known for some years. And so what do? We have identified the banks that have high commercial real estate concentrations, particularly office and retail, and other ones that have been affected a lot. We identify them, and we are in dialogue with them around, do you have your arms around this problem? Do you have enough capital? Do you have enough liquidity? Do you have a plan? You're going to take losses here. Are you being truthful with yourself and with your owners? And so we've been working with them. And so for some time we've been doing that. And this is a problem that we'll be working on for years more, I'm sure. There will be bank failures, but this is not the big banks. If you look at the very big banks, it's not a first order issue for any of the very large banks. It's more smaller and medium-sized banks that have these issues.
Stop right there.
We're working with.
So he said it. He said the quiet part out loud.
There will be.
There will be bank failures, right? We've already had 5, Silicon Valley Bank being the first one. So there is more to come. There is an opportunity for you, if you are an entrepreneur, to be able to take advantage of what's coming in the future. Now, this idea of a soft landing is a farce. It's never happened before. They've never been able to control.
When they say soft landing, what are they framing?
They're imagining these two little toggles, which is this idea of keeping consumer spending up, keeping employment up while simultaneously adjusting the interest rates and then letting the market settle. Because it's when they make the first adjustment, which was pretty aggressive, right? They increased rates pretty exponentially when they first started moving the rate needle. The market will hyperbolic correct, right? So we're starting to see that now. I think cap rates like in Dallas and Fort Worth, if we're talking about real estate, for example, I know that market pretty well. The cap rates were like 4% going into 2020. And then coming out of that, today they're like 5 3/4. That's a material decompression of cap rates, which means things just got a lot less valuable. For those of you who weren't alive or paying attention or had your head in the sand, I was fortunate enough to get baptized in the deep end of the pool. There's a guy who I follow for a really long time, and his name is Peter Schiff. And Peter Schiff is what I would call an Austrian economist. He's a big fan of laissez-faire, small government, and he's constantly advocating against everything that the Fed is doing because he knows long tail that it leads to the same thing. That's why it happened in 1929, 1987, 2000, 2008, and it'll probably happen again in 2025. He had a video that we're going to play for you guys. And this is really a highlight reel. So we'll only watch a little bit. It's 9 minutes and 59 seconds, almost 10 minutes. But he basically would go on every major news channel and he would effectively tell them that the housing market is built on absolutely nothing. It's going to collapse. Get out now while you can. And he got laughed off of every single station until, of course, it actually happened. And so this is where we're at today is there's all this PR going around by the major mainstream media, which is all controlled by the same people who are issuing this bad ideology, and they're trying to convince you otherwise. So this is just going to be a little reminder that don't believe everything you see on TV.
Recession or not, we're going to be joined by Art Laffer. He's Chief Investment Officer of Laffer Investments and former economic advisor to President Reagan, and Peter Schiff, he's president of Euro Pacific Capital. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Peter, I want to start with you. Although there are more and more people saying that the U.S. economy will be in a recession next year, it is still a minority position. Why do you think that a recession is coming? And just
Sounds
how bad
familiar,
is it going
right?
to be?
I think it's going to be pretty bad, and whether it starts in 07 or 8, I think is immaterial. And I also think it's going to last not just for quarters, but for years. See, the basic problem with the U.S. economy is we have too much consumption and borrowing and not enough production and savings. And what's going to happen is the American consumer is basically going to stop consuming and start rebuilding his savings, especially when he sees his home equity evaporate. And when you have the economy 70% consumption, you can't address those imbalances without a recession. You know, rather than the recession being resisted, it should really be embraced, because the disease is all this debt-financed consumption. The cure is that we stop consuming and start saving and producing again, and that's a recession. And sometimes, you know, medicine tastes bad, but you got to swallow it.
Art
Pause it right
Laffer,
there.
you hear him? He says the
So the argument today is like people have more in savings, their home equity is worth more, yada, yada, yada. The challenge there is equity in your home is paper money. So it's not real until you can extract it. So how would you extract it? You would extract it by refinancing and effectively doubling or tripling your interest rate, which would bring your mortgage payment up maybe from $3,000 to $6,000, or get a home equity line of credit, also driven by the interest rate environment. So who in their right mind is actually going to do it? So it's trapped equity that's not usable.
Right.
And so that means nothing to anybody. So great. My home is worth a lot more and I can't tap it. That means nothing. The other thing that they're not talking about right now is the fact that all these major organizations just laid off 85,000 people last week, right? They all wait until after the first of the year to do it because they don't want to hit their stock price, right? So now they let them off in the first quarter. And so the employment curve is changing quite a bit as well. But everything they're saying right now, it sounds pretty similar to what we're talking about right now. So I don't know how many times we can continually do the same thing and expect a different result, right? The only reason it happens is because people, not you guys listening to this or watching this on YouTube, it's people who put their head in the sand and they don't actually pay attention to what has happened in the past, the history of what has happened with our economy in this Keynesian economic environment. And so we're not going to cover this, but I'm going to put it in the show notes, which is, you can pull it up real quick just so everybody can get pop eyes on it. But it's this next document, which is the federal fund rates history. I would encourage you guys to go and read through this document so you can actually have an understanding of what has happened with interest rates over the last 30 years, right? And it's going to be very telling about where interest rates are today versus where they have been historically and what that actually means as it relates to what's going to happen next, how this is going to unfold. Because if they do lower interest rates, you're going to see another frenzy in the housing market. But we're not, as a country, we're not producing anything. We're not making anything better. And so what Peter Schiff said in that video is the truth, is the only way to fix the problem is to just let the free market do what it needs to do, which is fall apart.
You must reap what you sow, right?
Correct. It's biblical.
It's absolutely biblical. It's all over the place. You know, I think the one thing that I think about when I listen to him and is this word production. I think when we hear the word, you know, productivity, content is a trending thing online. But what does it mean for a nation to be productive, for citizens to be productive, to have a productive economy?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you straight up. I mean, if you just look at the end of World War II, Europe was in shambles. And so the United States at that point had the largest navy and military in the world. And they effectively said, hey, we're going to guard the waterways. And in order for you guys to rebuild, we're going to consume your goods.
Right.
And in exchange for us doing that, you're going to help us fight against the Red Army, Russia, who's now trying to infiltrate Europe in its weakness and try to take territory effectively. And so we did that and we became a consumer economy. And for the last, call it going on 80 years, we haven't actually been a producer economy. Now that's shifting, right? We're now a net producer of oil and gas. We are now moving manufacturing and things like that used to be overseas back stateside. We have more oil and gas in Saudi Arabia. We have more farmland, right? We have one of the greatest economically sovereign countries in the world. We don't actually need anybody. And prior to World War II, we didn't really participate. So we're going back that way, and that'll ultimately be what's going to save us. but we got to go through some dark times first.
Well,
and we got to realize that the way that we've done it sucks.
Yeah, the way that we've done it sucks, and many of the ideas that are on the table suck.